welcome to SJW, Social Justice Weirdos. It's the podcast that has what you crave. Me, Charlie McCorn, I use they, them, their pronouns.
And me, Lenny Peppers, I use she, her pronouns.
That's right. It is SJW. It is the podcast that asks the important questions, like, why are we doing this? Why are we here? Who's listening? But that's okay. We're going to get the answers to those, one step at a time. Also, who killed our third nameless guest host? We're going to reveal clues through every episode, and at the end of the season, it will reveal who the murderer is. So make sure you're paying attention to every episode for the secret clues.
I don't think we needed them anyway.
No, they were an albatross around our necks, anchoring us down to the deeps of the blue, blue ocean. I say blue, blue there because it's the sound of someone crying, because the ocean's made up of tears, because our co-host is dead.
Yes.
But who did it? Find out on our season finale.
I mean, do we really need to find out? We shouldn't need to. No, I mean.
Okay, what are you, David Lynch? Let's just keep the mystery going. How about that? Why would you have to answer what the mystery is?
Okay, maybe we'll find out. Unless the person who did it, or, thing that did it, whatever it is.
Yeah, it absolutely could have been.
And nobody can figure it out then.
Sure, it could have been a stick of dynamite. Could have been an elk. It could have been any number of things.
Yeah. Elk. I mean, that sounds like terrifying way to die, actually. Death by elk.
So, I'm not even sure what we'd even call this podcast being about, but largely we talk about larger social issues and issues related to social justice through the lens of two weirdos kind of living in the middle of it. This week was my turn to pick, and we were talking about, I don't know if I'd call her one of my heroes, but definitely one of the most influential trans people of all time. That's Christine Jorgensen.
And I am super excited to hear what you have to say.
So what before we get into it, what do you know about Christine Jorgensen? Because I've been doing a lot of research here, and I'm always excited to share it, but it seems like most people I talk to don't really know who she is.
So Christine Jorgensen, I don't really know that much. I did a quick search before the show, and found that she was an American transgender woman who was the first to become widely known in the United States for having sex reassignment surgery. I know a couple things from a few shows here and there, like she's friends with Marilyn Monroe. There's just a couple of weird facts that I know, but beyond that, I don't really know much.
Yeah, I didn't know either, except for kind of the big picture. A lot of people will incorrectly say that she was the first person to have gender-affirming surgeries. That's not exactly true. Surgeries of this type were being done as early as 1930 in Germany. However, the records for those surgeries and the people that they happened on and the people that did the surgeries were all, in Germany in the 1930s. So records there, very, very spotty, tragically. So Christine Jorgensen, she was born, I hate using someone's quote-unquote dead name, but I think it will help sort of follow through. She was born George Jorgensen and was kind of like a real loser, like a real nerd. Had trouble making friends, had trouble doing activities, kind of listless, didn't really understand what was going on in their life, kind of like a weak, small-framed person. And their whole life, she realized, well, there's something different about me. I don't know what it is. There's something very, very different. And so she started sort of doing some investigations of her own. One of the investigations she came across, so she was briefly in the army. Now, a lot of people will say she was a GI, she's a former soldier that quote unquote changed her sex. That's not exactly true. She was drafted. She did serve in the army, but she was drafted after World War II had ended and was drafted as a clerk whose job was to help discharge all the returning GIs who were coming home from overseas. She used the GI Bill to get into a couple of different schools. She studied photography. Photography was really her big passion. She wanted to just be a photographer, but she felt there was something different about her. So she started doing some research. She used the GI Bill to go in and try to get a lab tech certification, kind of. And here she was reading about how there were scientists who had done incredible things by transposing animals' sex hormones back and forth. So a scientist had actually like injected like the chicken equivalent of estrogen into a rooster, and it had developed like secondary sexual characteristics of a hen, and vice versa. And she thought, well, that's crazy. Could I do that? And so she went down to a pharmacist and said, hi, yeah, I need a bottle of Advil. I need some tissue paper. I need all the estradiol that you have, and also some cough syrup. And the pharmacist said, I can't give you this wonder drug, this synthetic estrogen, without, a prescription. And she says, oh no, it's cool. I'm a med student. It's for a science experiment. And so that's how she walked away with the biggest bottle of estradiol that she could get her hands on.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's pretty punk rock. Like, that's pretty, that's taking, your life in your own hands. That's very much like, you know what, I'm taking care of this. The response that her body had to it was positive enough that she began talking to other doctors. Many of them, like, laughed her right out of their offices until she met a sympathetic doctor. And she's like, hey, I think I might have been born wrong. And I think I need to be able to fix it. Which means then she goes to Denmark under the cover of, well, I'm a photographer. I'm going to come and film a nature documentary, a travel log of Denmark that I'll be able to present to people. But in reality, she actually went and visited a doctor whose name was Christian Hamburger, who was highly recommended by the doctors. He was Europe's most eminent endocrinologist, and his treatise on hormone studies had been widely published in medical journals throughout the world. So she was of Danish descent, so she had family living in Denmark.
Mm-hmm.
She heads over, and she's like, hey, doc, listen, what if we do this crazy thing together? Like, what if I start doing this, and then you can, like, study me and, like, do all these experiments to help, like, figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
And Dr. Hamburger was like, yeah, absolutely. I am down to do a little bit of mad science here, which meant that Christine had to save every specimen of urine that she produced for almost 2 years.
Wow.
She carried a big bottle with her wherever she went, just so she could take it back to the doctor and be like, well, here's my pee. Good luck looking at it. Here's where her story gets a little wild. Here's where it gets a little crazy. Well, crazy. At this point, she's like, well, obviously I'm having a great reaction to this. My features are softening. I'm developing secondary sexual characteristics. So she writes a letter home to her parents with a picture of her wearing a dress for the first time. She was not like a quote unquote a cross-dresser, or to use the terminology at the time, she wasn't a transvestite. She had never had any interest in that until she started doing hormone replacement therapy, HRT. And she wrote a letter home to her parents saying, like, hey, mom and dad, so I know you think I've been in Denmark taking photographs of nature for 2 years, but here's what I'm actually doing. Her parents were incredibly supportive. They were shocked, certainly, because this, again, was not, while trans people existed and have existed for a long time, they weren't in the common parlance. And then Christine starts doing gender-affirming surgeries. And at this point, this is when her story, as I said, gets a little out of control.
Mm-hmm.
One of her letters home gets intercepted by a relative, by like a shirt-tail relative, who then tells the press. And then while Christine is recovering from one of her surgeries, she is inundated with thousands of letters and telegrams from newspapers around the world. She became overnight, literally overnight, an international celebrity.
Wow.
The news of her surgeries and her transition pushed out of the news the death of King George of England, pushed out the news of the Korean War.
Wow.
And this was 1951, so every major story that was happening was pushed out by Christine Jorgensen. In the copy of her memoir that I have, the introduction is by Susan Stryker, who's a very prolific and talented gender doctor of gender studies professor at the University of Arizona. And she brings up, I think very interestingly, that the number of words produced about Christine Jorgensen in that year would be enough to fill over 15 books. And big books, too.
Wow.
Yeah.
I was just
It's
looking at one of the um, articles here, and it says
Mhm.
XGI becomes blonde beauty. Big letters.
Yep, that was probably from the New York Daily News, which was the newspaper that broke the story. And as I said, she wasn't technically a GI, but she was very aware that like this image of her as a rough and tumble soldier, which she never really was, probably fueled a lot of the news media's attention about her.
Hmm.
And this is the tragic part. This is the part that I kind of hate. She was so happy to just kind of like finally be herself and then be able to like, okay, great, I'm going to be able to just like live my life as a photographer in this body I'm comfortable with, feeling good about myself. But she couldn't just be like a simple photographer anymore. She couldn't just be like making these documentaries. She couldn't be doing this work. She was too famous to. She couldn't just live this life that she was building for, this like simple life, that she wanted as a photographer,
Yeah.
which sucks, I would say. I mean, that part is frustrating. And so uh following her return back to the States, where she was greeted by dozens, if not hundreds, of reporters waiting at the airport for her. Like when her parents came to visit her in Denmark, they had to like travel under assumed names and like go in different entrances and like get on the plane before everyone else could even get near it, just so people were trying to take so many photos of what was going on. The newspapers were just like blowing up with all of these rumors and untrue stories about her. She also was very aware of, once her story broke, Dr. Christian Hamburger. She took the name Christine from Dr. Christian Hamburger because she was so thankful for what he did for her in his life, or in her life. I'm not sure where the subject of that sentence was, but it all works out. That she wanted to, honor him, so she took his name as her first name. But at this point, hundreds, if not then thousands, of people, quote unquote, men and women, were writing saying, "Hey, I'm the same way. What can we do to fix this?" And so for a lot of trans people who had no idea that there were ways to mitigate, the disaster of their bodies, that they were living in, were suddenly like empowered, suddenly had a goal, had a solution, had a way out.
Yeah.
Although the Danish government was like, "Yeah, well, we did this, but this surgery is only for citizens of Denmark." So they kind of restricted it there. So she returns home and does, I think, what anyone does after becoming a celebrity for no good reason. She got into show business.
Hmm.
She ended up going on tour where she would sing, she would tell jokes, she would put on like a whole kind of review. And she wasn't great at it to start, but eventually sort of like picked it up, and kind of the rest of her life, she died in the 1980s, was kind of, based around this career that she had built up, not as a photographer, but as a singer and a performer and an entertainer, which she wasn't the most crazy about, but it works okay. Everywhere she went, however, she was, huge news. She met the biggest names in arts and entertainment and politics. Some politicians did not care for her, and obviously she got a lot of blowback. Not from her parents, though. My favorite story, I think, came from her memoir, is her parents write her a letter saying, like, "Hey, we love you no matter what happens. We did go and we told our church what had happened." And the church was just so supportive. The church was like, "Oh, really? A miracle happened. That's phenomenal. That's thank God that young Christine can now, live this life. Thank you, God." And you know, it's interesting. As someone who's had definitely some rejection from their own family after coming out as trans, it definitely hit something in me.
Definitely. I mean, it really is sad that she couldn't just go and do like her photography work, that she had to like, because of, you know, becoming who she wanted to be, she now had to be that for like everybody. Like she
Yeah.
had suddenly an obligation to the world to be this person for the other people that needed her to be this person. And so that's really kind of tragic to me.
Yeah, there is that level of tragedy to it. I think that any story about someone, achieving fame, this story of gaining fame is always, accompanied with like being disconnected from oneself. So it's really ironic that like on her quest to find herself, she kind of made herself a bit more cut off from the world than she was before.
Yeah.
That's sort of the basics of her story. From our sort of like in our nerdy horror movie world. So in 1955, director Edward D. Wood Jr. was commissioned by a little exploitation studio run by George Myers, I believe was the name of the producer, to make the Christine Jorgensen story into a film. Christine said, "No, I never gave you the rights for that. If you want my story, pay me, bitch." And so they sort of filed off all of Christine Jorgensen's information and still told basically the same story, or were supposed to, but the movie that Edward D. Wood Jr. turned in, which was titled Glen or Glenda, was mostly just a movie about Wood's own cross-dressing. And then the last, like, 10 minutes of the movie, done almost entirely in stock footage, is the story of someone who is not Christine Jorgensen, but is Christine Jorgensen, sort of told through stock footage of her as a brave GI fighting in World War II. And it's such a baffling movie. I've shown Glen or Glenda a few times. It's such a weird movie, but that was sort of where Ed Wood, who would go on to be, quote unquote, the worst director of all time, got his start.
Interesting. Who else was in that? I'm trying to remember.
Bela Lugosi playing the mad scientist narrator.
Oh, that.
Pull the string.
Mad
Pull the string.
Narrator. Oh my gosh. Okay.
Yeah, Glen or Glenda is such a baffling movie, and not just because it's not necessarily about a transgender person, but about the director's like own relationship with his own cross-dressing, which for a movie made like the 1950s, pretty baller move there, Ed Wood.
It was, but I think the way that it was done is technically about someone else and not at all about his own cross-dressing to the like general public, but to film theorists, they would be like, oh yeah, that's totally about Ed Wood. But how did that contribute to the way that trans people were shown in horror films from then on?
I would say Ed Wood's oeuvre obviously fits into this and some of the more shitty tropes that trans people face. But the one that I think did the most damage, and this is a great movie. I like it. I watch it at least every year. But Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho really created sort of that trope of, oh, how do we shorthand for the audience that someone is mentally ill or quote unquote psycho? Oh, let's make them a quote unquote man in a dress.
Yeah.
Which is something that has carried through, like, even today. Like, I still see it in movies, which is really frustrating. Greener Grass that came out last year, while using a cis actress, still uses the trope of a quote unquote man in a dress to signify, oh, look at this killer. But there are dozens of movies like this. Never Too Young to Die, Dressed to Kill, Silence of the Lambs. All of these movies that sort of use that as shorthand, as like, which sucks. And as someone that loves horror movies and is trans, it really sucks to see myself only portrayed kind of in that way.
Absolutely. So, were there any films out before this that had kind of that theme, or was this like one of the first ones? Or
it was probably one of the first ones. There were, obviously cross-dressing on stage has been a huge part of theater and entertainment back to Shakespeare's day at the very least. But in movies, there's movies like Some Like It Hot, where the joke is, haha, these men are in dresses. But the idea was never like, oh, what if there's a different kind of person? Like, what if there are actually like women who have to have gender affirming surgeries or feel the need to? It's always like, hey, let's put a man in a dress. Isn't that hilarious? Like, there's a bunch of that. But like cross-dressing or queerness, obviously queerness, coded villains have been around forever. But, nothing until like the 1950s, because Christine Jorgensen kind of was the one that told the whole world about trans people. She was the first one to be like, I didn't know I was this thing, but it turns out there were a lot of people like me, and I kind of had to be the one that told the world that we exist.
Mm-hmm. The first transsexual celebrity. I was reading this article. I think that I actually saw an episode of this in another podcast called Fierce: Stories of Women Who Changed the World.
Oh, nice. We'll put a link to that in the show notes.
Definitely. But I'm really excited to like know more about this.
It's a really interesting story. I have actually have 2 copies of her memoir. I'm doing a research project right now on queer art in response to Christine Jorgensen.
Oh, really? That's cool. Tell me more about that.
Well, so as Dr. Susan Stryker says in the introduction, you know, hundreds of thousands of words were written about Christine Jorgensen, but all of them, almost, if not all of them, were all written by straight cis people.
Uh-huh.
There was never like, what do queer people think about this? Because, it's the 1950s. It was still illegal, in many places, illegal to be gay. It was also illegal to quote unquote impersonate a female. And a lot of people were like, one story is of the stand-up comedian Ray Bourbon. And she's basically what we would consider like a drag queen today. In 1955, though, I love this, she announced to the world that she too had the Christine Jorgensen operation and released a comedy album called Let Me Tell You About My Operation, which isn't all about being trans or that. It's just like a recycle of her other material, but she also became kind of a big celebrity, not as big as Christine, but a big celebrity in the US during like the 1950s into the 60s, because I was like, oh, look, this one does stand-up comedy.
Yeah.
And so it's people like Ray Bourbon, it's people like Ed Wood. They were reacting to this news. And that's the story I want to get. I don't care what straight people thought about her. I don't care what cis people thought about her.
Right.
People were writing to her saying, like, what can I do? And there were like other like notable, quote unquote, using the verbiage of the time, transsexuals. Charlotte McLeod was one of the second ones that sort of made big news, also kind of in the shadow of Christine Jorgensen. And it's their stories that I care about. It's not how society viewed them, because society was shitty and continues to be shitty to queer people, but it's their reactions to this huge news is what sort of is the focus of my study, my research.
So you said there's art projects being done. Are you personally doing anything?
I am writing a paper, like not necessarily like an academic paper, but I am writing about this. I'm writing about the queer reactions to this. As for art, you and I did a photo shoot. Oh boy, when was that now? February? Time means nothing anymore. Where I stood in for Ray Bourbon, recreating a bunch of her famous album covers.
Yeah, that was a blast. And
that was so much fun.
Those turned out so good.
They really did. You were a fantastic photographer, and I look so beautiful and spooky in them.
Absolutely. We can see those on your page, right?
Yeah, charleymacorn.com, CharleyMacorn.com.
We are artists and social justice weirdos who do stuff like this all the time. And so I'm sure in the future there will also be other amazing pieces of artwork done by Charley and I to show on Charley's page.
Okay, as a trans person, obviously her life and her story has huge overarching influences on the life that I'm living now, even without me knowing who she is. And I talked to some of my trans friends about her, and they had no idea who she was outside of like, oh, she was the first person to have a sex change operation.
Yeah. That's all I knew coming into this as well.
And that's a huge influence. I mean, she walked so people like me could run.
Mm-hmm.
And, again, as a trans person, it's really frustrating when I hear all these pundits or dum-dums online who are like, oh, well, this is just a fad. All of a sudden, trans people showed up. Like, well, no. Like, we were talking about this as a society in the early 1950s. This is almost 80 years, coming up on 80 years now, of society being aware of it. This is not a fad. It's not a trend. it is a continual mass exodus of trans and gender nonconforming people from the closet. And Christine kind of kicked that closet door open. She didn't mean to. She wanted just to be a photographer, but she, when life gives you lemons, you fight a horse, I guess.
Yeah. Um, the other thing is like people only see this coming into exist, like this thing happening like in the 1950s. But as you said, like there have been surgeries and others, things being done
Oh yeah,
since
back in
1930s, even.
Yeah, even in ancient Greece, there, and again, I'm not trying to ascribe any identity to a historical group or people that would not have the language to describe themselves as this. I'm not doing that. But there was a goddess of divine femininity, I believe, in ancient Greece, and the quote unquote male-bodied attendants, to join in and be a member of her clergy, they would dance themselves into a fury, and then they would castrate themselves on the steps of her temple. And then after that, they'd start wearing makeup and start dressing in more feminine clothing.
Mm-hmm.
And again, not saying that these were all trans people, but gender diversity dates back forever. And it's always been here. It's not a new thing. It's not a trend. We just have a way to talk about it now in a language we never had before.
Right. I know some indigenous people had up to 5 different genders within their societies. So,
which date back, as thousands of years before any colonial interference.
Right.
And that sucks because there's something I always like. I was at this was obviously in the before times, but I was at a poetry reading where the two-spirit poet Stephen Bear read.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not obviously trying to glom on, I'm not trying to co-opt or jump on to an identity, but something that they said that stuck out with me is that before we the white people showed up, before this, the two-spirit people, the people who were, not inside what we in our modern eyes know as like the gender binary, were seen as sacred, we're seen as divine, we're seen as important to culture. And that, as someone who feels very unimportant to culture sometimes, that really, really touched me. Even though we are of different experiences, I would say, the poet Stephen Bear and I. But it really stood out to me that the world doesn't have to be the way that it is.
Exactly. Yeah, totally.
And that's kind of it for Christine Jorgensen. She died in 1989, sort of popping up here and there as a celebrity. Her story has kind of like fallen out of popular knowledge, but she's a really fascinating lady who was a real fucking pioneer, who really changed the world. And I'm very grateful to her journey.
Me too. I agree that we need to bring her story and her light back into our stories today because, as a mother of a trans child, I want them to be able to see themselves reflected in positive ways and to be able to know that this isn't something that they have to feel like they're changing all by themselves right now, but that there's a history of people going through this that they can lean on and use as support as they're making their own journey.
Yeah, I think that it is important for us to preserve our history, because the society that has put down trans people, that 2019 the CDC called the violence against trans people an epidemic. Society is not happy that we exist. Society wants to actively kill us, but having the actual history, having community, having a vision of where we kind of fit in this grand, beautiful story is more important than ever right now.
The way that trans history and indigenous history kind of go hand in hand when it comes to not being able to tell our stories or having ourselves completely erased from history, and having, even to this day, terrible representations of ourselves, as well as people who want to see us not exist. Being able to see this on all of these different levels has been like just mind blowing. You know what? I'm really happy that we're making this, because this is these are the exact things that I want my own kids to be like looking at and listening to and talking about. And so I know that they listen to my podcasts, and
Because you force them to.
yeah, I mean, I need those numbers. But I also think it's important. And so I think that we're talking about the things that I want my own kids to be learning about and talking about. And I think that's great.
Well, I'm very glad that I can help facilitate that. I'm glad that we can do this together.
Exactly. I am so thankful that you brought this story up today. I'm also super excited about the topic that I've picked for next week's episode.
Ooh, what's next week's episode?
Yeah, I think you're going to be excited too. Next week, I'm going to talk about seances and Native American ghosts.
Ooh, I am excited for that. We are in the spooky season after all.
Yeah, I have been dying to talk about this somewhere to someone for like 3 years. And so I have tons of information on it, and I'm totally going to blow your mind with this one.
I literally cannot wait, and I'm sure our listener cannot wait either. Let's go ahead and wrap it up then. So this has been SJW, Social Justice Weirdos. Thank you again for listening. For more information, I don't know, listen to more of these podcasts. I'm not your mom. You figure it out, you weirdo.
All right, I'm Lenny Peppers.
I'm Charlie McCorn. Remember, change the fucking world, or at the very least, throw a brick.
Bye.